Hello and welcome to this lecture on the 1920s. The 1920s are such a pivotal and important era in American history. They are significant for changing the culture of America and for so many important pieces of legislation that will have a profound impact on America right through a large part of the 20th century. Now, in a course like this, as a survey class, we don't have all of the time to spend and go into the depth and detail the 1920s deserves. But what we will do in this lecture is spend some time talking about American foreign policy in the 1920s, thinking about race and race relations in the 1920s, the immigration situation in the 1920s, and then thinking broadly about the presidential administrations of the 1920s. All right, let's begin. Let's start by having a conversation about America and the world after the Great War. Like all the participating countries of World War I, American GIs returned from the war greatly disillusioned. American servicemen were shocked by the brutality, death, and inhumanity of the war. I've said this before, and I'll say this again. It's very hard for us living in the 21st century to understand the sheer shock and trauma and horror of World War I and the impact it had upon the entire generation that lived through it. In part, that's because we are a century removed from World War I. In part, it's because World War II was such a larger and broader conflict in which there's even more death and casualties that World War II, in our popular imagination, dwarfs World War I. But the reality is World War I was unlike anything that any person had ever seen before. It was the first industrial war. It was the first war with modern weapons. And the capacity, the devastating capacity for destruction and death that modern industrial weapons could cause when used against one another was simply something that the soldiers and the public were not prepared for. And what happens after the war is the American public was so deeply disillusioned by the war, the experiences of the war, by the Wilsonian policies to squash dissent and to quell free speech during the war, and then just the sheer devastation and the casualty numbers, that the public as a whole began to question whether American participation was worth the price, whether the price that America paid was worth the outcome of the war. And so what you had was an America, the American public, that was deeply ambivalent about its place in the world and relationships that the United States should have with countries in the world, particularly relationships that might lead the United States to get involved in another large-scale war. And so what you see in the United States in the 1920s is a reticence to involve itself in a lot of international events and a lot of international affairs. Now, the traditional narrative that is told about America in the 1920s is that we withdrew from the world as a country, and we entered a period called isolationism, in which the United States wanted to isolate itself from the rest of the world. And as the traditional narrative that scholars tell and the historians tell, and that the general public believes about what happened in the 1920s with respect to America and its role in the world after World War I. This traditional viewpoint that Americans embraced isolationism is only accurate to a certain point. It's only true to a certain point. It is true that the United States did greatly reduce its military capacity after the war. You can tie that reduction in military capacity directly to American disillusionment and resentment and anger and the tragedy of World War I, without question. So the United States had built a very large military to participate in World War I, and then after the war we promptly began to reduce the size and scale of our military. We also tried to convince other countries to follow suit. For instance, the United States tried to broker widespread agreement on the size of navies. This is known as the Washington Naval Agreement or Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, which the United States tried to convince other countries to limit the size of their navies, to reduce the size and to put a cap on the size that they would spend and grow their navies. The thought process behind this was that if navies were smaller, then the wars that navies engaged in could be smaller. And this was seen among many Americans as the first step to limiting the size of militaries. Even though several countries signed agreements that are known as the Washington Naval Agreements or the Washington Naval Treaty, the reality is most other industrial countries in Europe had no desire to engage in this kind of demilitarization. It is also true, as part of its rejection of entanglements abroad, the United States rejected the membership in the League of Nations. We talked about this in the World War I lecture, which is that the League of Nations was Woodrow Wilson's idea, embedded in the Treaty of Versailles, to have an international body capable of resolving disputes without the need to resort to warfare. But the United States refused to join the League of Nations for fear it would create international relationships and alliances that would require American military intervention somewhere down the road. And the U.S. was not just a signer, but an initiator of something known as the Kellogg-Briand Pact. The Kellogg-Briand Pact was an agreement between France and the United States that they would not use war as a means to resolve their disputes. And the United States tried to get nations all over the world to sign the Kellogg-Briand Pact. And the conceit behind this is if you got enough nations to sign it, you would effectively outlaw war. That you would, by international agreement, remove warfare from the toolbox of how nations interacted with one another and they resolved their disputes. And so these actions, the rejection of the League of Nations, the Washington Naval Agreement, the Kellogg-Briand Pact, combined with public sentiment, are often used to illustrate that after World War I, Americans withdrew from the world. Now you have to understand something. This withdrawal narrative is told with a kind of moralistic view and point, which is that the United States isolated itself and wasn't playing a role in the world, and therefore wasn't active enough to stop the rise of Nazi Germany, the rise of Imperial Japan, both of which led to World War II. That's kind of the moral tale that is often told about American decisions in the 1920s to withdraw from the world. And those people who tell that tale say, if you look at these three instances here, the Naval Agreement, the League of Nations, and the Kellogg-Briand Pact, you can see the American desire to withdraw from the world and to, quote-unquote, shirk its international responsibilities. But as I told you just a moment ago, this traditional view of American withdrawal due to disillusionment is only true to a certain point. Yes, the United States did not join the League of Nations. Yes, they demilitarized and tried to convince other countries to do so as well. And yes, they tried to outlaw war. And yes, they in general avoided entanglements with European countries that they feared would lead the United States to be involved in military action. But to suggest that that means the United States had no interaction with the world is simply to ignore the facts of the decade. The United States is still an imperial power. And in the 1920s, it continued to occupy several Latin American and Caribbean countries that had been occupying since the earlier part of the 20th century. Now, it is actually physically occupying countries like Cuba and Puerto Rico and Haiti. There is some occupation in places like Panama. The United States is actively occupying Latin America. This is an outgrowth of the foreign policy articulated by Theodore Roosevelt with the Roosevelt Corollary. And even though you will see in the 1920s, the United States will withdraw from some countries in Latin America, like Haiti, that it's occupying, it won't withdraw from all of them. The United States will still be an imperial power, occupying or intervening in the affairs of Latin America. Similarly, in Asia, the United States remains a colonial power in the Philippines. They continue to occupy the Philippines. Now, in the 1920s, they will begin to make a plan for the Philippines to gain independence, but nevertheless, the Philippines is a militarily occupied place. There is no way to understand it differently. And of course, we're occupying islands in the Pacific, like the Hawaiian Islands or Guam, or places like that. And we are hugely engaged in affairs in China to keep those Chinese markets open. In addition to that, the United States will support and back corporate interests in Latin America and Asia. The United States corporations in the 1920s, the United States has the world's largest economy. The 1920s is the Roaring Twenties. It's when America becomes an economic juggernaut. We'll talk about that in the next lecture, but the economy is growing in the 1920s. And the United States will be deeply interested in backing corporate interests of American business in Latin America. So American businesses were involved in things like oil in Mexico. And since Mexico was going through a revolution during the early part of the 20th century, the United States is very interested in making sure American companies get their investment back, given the new political reality in Mexico. The United States companies are heavily involved in the rainforest. For instance, Ford Motor Company is heavily involved in the rainforest with rubber plantations for tires for their automobiles. American corporations are involved all over Asia and Latin America, and the United States is backing those efforts. Also, in 1924, the United States agreed to something called the Dawes Plan. And the Dawes Plan was a plan to use American banking money to help restart the European economies, which had been devastated in the aftermath of World War I. And so the United States backed American banks making loans and investments in Europe to help the European economy recover. So all this suggests that the traditional narrative of America withdrawing from the world in the 1920s is not entirely accurate. The United States did try to limit its military involvement and its military capacity. It did try and limit what it would perceive as events that might draw them into a conflict like World War I. At the same time, America remained an imperial power. And as an imperial power, it was heavily involved in Latin America and Asia. One of the other defining features of the 1920s is something known as the Red Scare and anti-communist fears. Now, there are two Red Scares in American history. And to be honest, when most people use the term Red Scare, they're referring to the second one, the one that happens after World War II, the one associated with Joseph McCarthy and fears of Soviet spies infiltrating the American government and the American military. We, of course, will talk about that in Unit 7. In Unit 7. But in this unit, we want to focus on the first Red Scare, a Red Scare that is not quite as well known, but is also profoundly important. So the first Red Scare in the United States is born out of events in Russia that unfolded during World War I. So in 1917, there was a revolution in Russia. This is commonly called the Russian Revolution or the Bolshevik Revolution. It can go by either names. Now, this was a revolution that replaced the government of Russia. The traditional government of Russia was a monarchy headed by a czar. And in 1917, the czar was overthrown, and there was an attempt at democratic government in the spring of 1917. And then that democratic government was overthrown in the fall of 1917 by communist forces. And the communists were known in Russia as the Bolsheviks. And so the Bolshevik Revolution is a communist revolution. And it is the first communist revolution in world history, creating the first communist government in American history, the first communist country in the first communist country in world history. First communist country in all of the world, and that is the Soviet Union, often abbreviated the USSR. The USSR stands for the United Soviet Socialist Republic, right? So the USSR, or the Soviet Union, is the first communist country in the world. Now, this communist country was proclaimed in the fall of 1917, technically in November of 1917. But the creation of the Soviet Union created a civil war in Russia that will last until 1922. And this civil war was brutal. As part of the Civil War was a brutal civil war. We're not going to talk about it in this particular class, we don't have time. But there's a brutal civil war. At the same time, the communist forces continue during the Civil War to gain ground. And in the areas they control directly, they begin to implement a pretty brutal totalitarian political regime, and they begin to consolidate the economy in the hands of the government. So they begin to do what's called collectivizing the economy. They collectivize agriculture, they collectivize industry, they collectivize mining, and so on and so forth. What collectivize means is there's no private property. The government begins to take control of that. The world is watching as this goes on. And all of a sudden, these events begin to spur fear in industrial capitalist countries that there could be a communist revolution in their own borders. Part of this fear comes about because the leader of the Soviet Union, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, often just known as Lenin is open about his desire for a global communist revolution, to spread the revolution beyond the borders of the Soviet Union. And so there is a fear that washes over many industrialized nations of the world, including the United States, about the spread of this revolution, about the violent overthrow of government and the abolishment of private property that is being done in the Soviet Union. And this fear is called the Red Scare. Now, it's called the Red Scare because red is the color of communism, their flags, and so on and so forth. So there's this fear. Now, this fear was overblown and exploited by certain groups with the explicit purpose of using this fear for their own political and economic aims. And I'll explain that in more depth in just a moment. But I just want to be clear here. To be sure, there are communist groups in the United States in the 1920s. We know that because we have explored that before. These communist groups have existed in the United States since the late 19th century. Communist and socialist groups were active in the labor movement. The International Workers of the World, one of the major national unions in the United States, founded in 1905, was founded explicitly to communist and socialist ideas. And socialist and communist leaders were very active in the United States. And many communist and socialist leaders in the United States were very vocal about wanting a communist system, a socialist system, criticisms of capitalism and the industrial economy and of the corporations. And they were also, many of them, openly cheering on what went on in Russia, thinking that it could be the start of a global communist movement. And of course, we know that these communist and socialist groups were very active in the reforms of the Progressive Era. That said, it's not as if we had an enormous number of communist and socialist groups in this country. And it's not as if these groups presented a serious threat to the industrial capitalist system of the United States. But what had happened during the Progressive Era is that business and commerce had seen, through legislation, policies that they did not like. They did not like income taxes. They did not like the breaking up of trusts and monopolies. They did not like laws trying to hamper the use of child labor. They did not like laws that favored unions. They did not like laws that regulated the workplace and made it safer. And so the Progressive Era, which had come before the 1920s, represented a setback for business and commercial groups. And what happens is that business and commerce are looking to push back at the progress that workers and unions have made in the 1920s. And they're willing to exploit the horror the American public feels over the communist revolution in Russia. It allows them to exploit that to get the political aims that they want. Events on the ground in the United States, in addition to what was going on in Russia, helped businesses and corporations make these, paint communists as dangerous. Between 1919 and 1923, there were several attempts by unions to engage in large-scale strikes and industrial sabotage to try and get concessions from business. The worst of it was in 1919. Why 1919? Because most businesses, most unions had agreed to not strike during World War I. They considered their patriotic duty to support the war by going to work and not engaging in organized labor activities like strikes and work stoppages. But after the war, they wanted to engage in this because the war had been very, very good to business, and business had made a lot of money, and they felt like the businesses had done so exploiting the patriotism of the workers. And so in 1919, you see labor strikes all over the United States. It was nicknamed by newspaper at the time the quote-unquote Red Summer. And this played right into the hands of businesses and corporations and the wealthy who wanted to paint unions as radicals who would bring a Bolshevik-style revolution with all of its death and horror and atrocities into this country. And it worked. There's a general backlash in the public against unions, against labor activists, against the idea that workers have rights, that workers are being exploited by businesses and corporations. The Red Scare, in so many ways, was a manufactured crisis by business to ensure that the public was not sympathetic to workers in a way they were in the Progressive Era. And it worked. It worked. The 1920s is another heyday for big business. The 1920s it represents setbacks for all of the goals that workers and unions were hoping to achieve. So keep that in mind as we're moving forward. The other thing we want to talk about with respect to the 1920s is immigration policy, specifically immigration restrictions. The 1920s represents the victory of nativism, xenophobia, and racism. And we'll talk about racism on the next slide, but in this slide, we want to talk about nativism and xenophobia. If you recall from previous units, we talked about nativist and xenophobic movements before. Nativist movements were anti-immigrant groups who believed that immigrants were destroying America, that America should be for quote-unquote native-born Americans only. And without any sense of irony or hypocrisy, they meant white Anglo-Saxon Protestants and not Native Americans. And xenophobia was a fear of foreigners. What World War I had done is helped anti-immigrant activists and nativists gain traction with the American public. Because what World War I did was it demonstrated in the minds of many people that Europeans were bloodthirsty, that Europeans were corrupt, and that Europeans were different than Americans. And the events in Russia only accelerated this. And so what World War I did was turn the American public against all things quote-unquote foreign. The war, the Red Scare, just accelerated nativist sentiments and xenophobia in the American society. And what you end up seeing happen is between 1917 and 1924, as the U.S. will pass a series of immigration restrictions. the first such mass restrictions in American history. And they are in reaction to World War I and the reaction to the Red Scare, because those two events give nativists the opportunity to capitalize on public fears. And so what we're going to do for just the next few moments is go through the immigration restrictions that were passed between 1917 and 1924. But before we do, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the ideas upon which these immigration restrictions were based. The immigration restrictions between 1917 and 1924, particularly the final version of them in 1924, were based upon the writings of a gentleman named Madison Grant, whose photo is here on the left. And Madison Grant was a sociologist and an intellectual who was most famous in his own day for writing a book called The Passing of the Great Race that was published before World War I, but became the Bible for anti-immigrant zealots and nativists and legislatures who wanted to reduce and restrict immigration between 1917 and 1924. The general thesis of the passing of the Great Race is that immigration is killing America. The passing of the Great Race accepts as scientifically true social Darwinism and eugenics. Now, we've talked quite a bit about social Darwinism and eugenics in this class, so I'd like to just remind you. Social Darwinism is this idea derived from Darwinian biology that races, human races, which are social constructs and cultural constructs and political constructs, are not created by law or policy. Instead, races are species. That the quote-unquote white race is a separate species of human from the quote-unquote black race or the quote-unquote Chinese race or so on and so forth. And that these species are in competition for the limited resources available on Earth, and it's survival of the fittest to see who claims them. And social Darwinism argues that what history has shown is that the white race, and white being defined, is basically Western and Northern Europe. Western and Northern Europe. Primarily the United States, WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. That social Darwinists argue that that group has been proven to be the superior species. And eugenics argues that if that's true, then governments and society have a responsibility to ensure that those populations are the ones growing and that there's no intermixing with quote-unquote lesser populations. Now, please, let me be clear here. There is no scientific basis for any of these ideas. That social Darwinism and eugenics are BS science. They are BS science. They are a false science. They're a pseudoscience. There is no truth whatsoever to any of their scientific claims. But in the late 19th and early 20th century, many white supremacists accepted them as true. And Madison Grant was one of them. And in this book, what Madison Grant does is he takes these ideas and uses them to analyze America as he saw it in the early 20th century. What Madison Grant argues in The Passing of the Great Race is that the United States had cultivated its own unique version of the white race. And this own unique version of the white race was descended from Elizabethan and Jacobean England. So think the England of Shakespeare, if you will. What's often called, what we call today as historians, Tudor-Stuart England. Because that's when, according to Madison Grant, the bulk of the white population could trace its descent from immigrants who came over to the colonial period during that time. And he says that group of people had developed a quote-unquote superior stock. By superior stock, he means like superior genetic material, but they didn't know about genes back then. So they're superior stock. And that superior stock is what led to American greatness. And then the late 19th century happened and immigration happened. And Madison Grant said immigration resulted in inferior peoples being brought to the United States. And those inferior peoples were weighing down the national stock, quote unquote. And what he means by there is gene pool. He says that true white Americans won't intermarry with them. And true white Americans are so disgusted by, and he uses the term mongrels. He also uses a term called Caliban, Caliban-like figures. And Caliban, he's drawing from a figure in one of Shakespeare's most famous plays called The Tempest. And Caliban is described in The Tempest as kind of this monstrous being who's not quite human. And Madison Grant argues in The Passing of the Great Waste that this mongrel mix of peoples that's forming the United States, this Caliban-like figures that are forming the United States, that what's happening is that they're taking over as the dominant population, not the pure white people descended from colonial stock. And he says that's a problem because as the pure white people from colonial stock disappear, America will decline. Because that race is declining. That's the great race that is passing, as alluded to in his title of his book. And he says, if America really wants to turn itself around, it'll stop immigration. It'll halt it. It'll enact laws preventing intermarriage, miscegenation laws. And it will promote it will promote the pure people having families in order to get the stock of America back to where it is so that America can be great again. This is what he proposes in The Passing of the Great Race. By the way, this book was not just influential on American lawmakers, it was influential in Germany as well. Adolf Hitler read The Passing of the Great Race with great interest and was a huge proponent of its ideas, and will even award Madison Grant honors, honors from the German government when he takes control. So these ideas are if they seem like they're white supremacists, they seem like they're Nazi ideas. Well, they are, but they were born in America, and Nazis later picked them up. So these horrible, racist, white supremacist ideas in Madison Grant become the basis for immigration laws passed between 1917 and 1924. The first really big one happens in 1921. It's called the Emergency Immigration Act. What the Emergency Immigration Act says is we're going to restrict immigration and ban other forms of immigration. So what they're going to do is they're going to restrict immigration from Europe. They're going to restrict immigration from Europe for the first time. And the restrictions are going to be the restrictions are going to reduce the number of people that can come in. And it's going to say they can only come in the people are not allowed to come in the United States with just if they want to. They're not allowed to come in freely. That immigration is going to be restricted by country. And every country is going to have a quota. This is what's called national origins. They're going to do a quota system for the number of immigrants they're letting in. And every country in Europe is going to get a quota. And once that country fulfills its quota, well then no more from that country can come in. So national origins, quotas, become the basis for this Emergency Immigration Act to restrict immigration from Europe. With respect to Asia, they just ban all immigration from Asia. So they look at the template for the Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned all immigration from China. They look at that template and they say, that's the template we're going to use for all of Asia. So all of Asia, they ban immigration from all of Asia. Once again, these are ideas of white supremacy and racism fueling American immigration policy. This is eugenics in action. This is taking ideas from guys like Madison Grant and saying, well, they say that it's our job to engineer a particular kind of society, a white society based on our notions of whiteness. Well, here are the immigration laws that achieve that. We ban all immigration from Asia because they're not considered white, and then what we're going to do is we're going to go through Europe and restrict immigration on the basis of national origins or country. We'll talk more about those quotas in just a moment, but to continue the story, now in 1924, a new immigration law is passed. This law is often called the Johnson-Reed Act, after the two congressmen who sponsored it. Sometimes it's called the Immigration Act of 1924. Sometimes it's called the Immigration Quota Act of 1924. Sometimes it's called the National Origins Act of 1924. It goes by different names, but it's the same basic thing. 1924, the National Origins Act makes all of this permanent. So immigration is banned permanently from Asia from 1924. And then the idea of quotas on the basis of national origins is made permanent. Now let's talk a little bit about these quotas. So what the United States is going to do is they're going to say, okay, we're going to set a cap for immigration. And so the initial cap set in 1924 was around 167,000 people. So that's the total number of immigrants they're going to let in, 167,000. But it's not 167,000 first come, first serve. It is a country by country on the basis of national origins. And so what they do is they use census data from the 1880s and 1890s to come up with the quotas. Now, why did they pick the 1880s and 1890s? Because most of the immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe happened after the 1880s and 1890s. And the reason that was important is that these quotas are designed to favor immigration from England and Scotland and France and Germany and the Netherlands and other places in Northern Europe, and restrict immigration from Southern Europe, think Italy and Greece, and from Eastern Europe, think Russia, Poland, Yugoslavia, so on and so forth. So the idea here was based on social Darwinistic ideas of superior races. And social Darwinism argued the superior race were people from Northern and Western Europe. So they got the biggest quotas under the quota system based upon national origins. By contrast, smaller quotas went to, and by small I mean very tiny quotas, went to places in countries from Southern Europe and countries from Eastern Europe. That was by design. And of course, as you well know from our previous lectures, immigrants were coming in after 1890 from England, France, Germany, so on and so forth. Those places didn't have a lot of immigration after 1890. The immigrants were coming from Italy and Greece and Bosnia and Croatia and Serbia and Poland and Hungary and Russia. And those were the very people that were being denied. Why were they being denied? Because according to the ideas of social Darwinism, they were an inferior people. And since the idea upon which these immigration acts are based is based on eugenics, the engineering of society to achieve a particular outcome, then what you're trying to do is reduce immigration as a whole, and within that reduction, basically encourage a particular kind of immigration and restrict a different kind of immigration. These immigration laws were done on the basis of encouraging white immigration, and white being how it was politically and legally understood in the 1920s. In the 1920s, people from Italy, people from the Balkans, people from Eastern Europe were not legally constructed as white. The other target of these immigration laws were Jews. Jews were the other target of these immigration laws. These laws were intended to reduce enormously Jewish immigration. And these laws will help contribute to the high death toll of the Holocaust. In the 1930s and 1940s, many Jews tried to flee Nazi Germany and Nazi-occupied territories in Eastern Europe, and they sought refuge in the United States. And these laws prevented them from getting in because they came from areas with small national quotas. So most of these refugees were turned away. They were either sent elsewhere, sometimes to places like Cuba or Latin America, or they were sent back to Europe. This is nativism, xenophobia, social Darwinism, and eugenics writing our laws, writing our immigration laws. It is a hugely consequential component in the 1920s. Following a few things up here. In 1924, the United States did finally grant citizenship to all Native Americans. Some Native Americans achieved their citizenship earlier through the Dawes Act, but this provided a pathway permanently for all Native Americans to achieve citizenship. Second thing is, the National Origins Act did allow for immigration from the Western Hemisphere unfettered. So what that meant is immigrants could come from Latin America, particularly from Mexico, and we see a large surge of immigrants from Mexico moving into the United States, particularly the Southwest, as a consequence of Southwestern farmers, loggers, miners needing labor. And since the immigration laws cut off their traditional sources of immigrant labor, they turned to Mexico for immigrant labor and recruited and encouraged it. And that was legal under this law. And we'll talk about that in a little bit in a later lecture. Last thing before we move on from immigration. Initially, the idea was to ban immigration from all of Asia. But the problem for the goal of these activists, the racist goal of these activists, was the Philippines. The Philippines was technically an American colony. And as a consequence, it was technically part of America. And so the courts ruled that you couldn't keep out Filipino migrants initially. That actually spurred conversations in the United States to grant a path to independence for the Philippines so they could have some measure of self-rule so that they could prevent Filipino immigration and migration to the United States. The Filipinos will be exempted for a period of time, thus allowing for another group of immigrants to be exploited by big business and the corporations in search of cheap labor. The 1920s also represents another low point in American race relations and in racism and in racial violence. As you might expect, when you see the rise of nativism, xenophobia, and ideas of social Darwinism and eugenics becoming part and parcel of American lawmaking, it is only inevitable that African Americans are going to see themselves targeted in the 1920s. The 1920s are an interesting period for African American history because it's a period of tremendous cultural experimentation and creativity for African Americans. It's the period of the Harlem Renaissance, meaning Harlem and New York, which produced an enormous explosion of creativity among the African American community. You had literature and poetry, gentlemen like Langston Hughes. You had art, African American art and artists. You had African American music became the pop culture sensation of the country. Jazz. Jazz was born out of African American music, the African American music tradition. Jazz is an African American musical invention, and jazz becomes the pop culture phenomenon of the 1920s. It becomes the soundtrack of the 1920s. What's ironic and tragically ironic about that is that as black music becomes part of white American pop culture, the very inventors of that artistic expression face enormous prejudice and discrimination. And what we see during the 1920s is African Americans subject to new waves of racist violence. Between 1919 and 1923, there are dozens of racist mobs and rioters attacking African American communities. Two of the worst happen in Chicago and Tulsa, Oklahoma. Now, Tulsa, Oklahoma is in the Southern Plains. It's part of the South. It has segregation. Rosewood, Florida, which is another horrible event, that's in Florida, which was part of the Confederacy, which had segregation. But Chicago is in the north, and in many ways, Chicago is the most revealing of these episodes because it demonstrates the extent to which racism exists outside the South. And even if you don't have formal Jim Crow segregation, there are still racist barriers and racist segregation. So the Chicago race riot in 1919 is one of the worst in American history, but also one of the least known about. So Chicago had seen an influx of African Americans moving north as part of the Great Migration. I talked about that in a previous lecture, of African Americans moved from the South to find jobs in the industrial North. And this accelerated during World War I as there was more and more need for labor to meet the demands of the war. And so there's a growing African American community in Chicago. They primarily live in what's known as the South Side of Chicago. Now, there was no Jim Crow segregation in Chicago, and in general, Chicago was known for having progressive attitudes towards African Americans. However, in the early 20th century, tension between white and black communities began to grow. This bubbled over in the summer of 1919. So in July of 1919, there were people were attending a beach, were relaxing at a beach on Lake Michigan being one of the Great Lakes. Now, these beaches were not segregated, but there had always been an unofficial segregation line to these beaches, and between where white people would be on the beach and black people would be on the beach. What happened is that a young black boy got very, very close to the unofficial segregation line on this beach. And to be clear here, there is no line drawn in the sand, there's no law, there's nothing. This is just an unofficial line that white people had created and forced black people to accept. So this young black boy got close to this line while a day at a beach in the summer of 1919. A white man started throwing rocks at the boy and his friends to force them away from this unofficial segregation line. He ended up hitting one of the boys in the head with a rock, and he died. This, as you might expect, caused outrage among the black beachgoers. And so the black beachgoers got angry and they began to confront the man who had thrown the rocks. And other white people had come to support this gentleman who had murdered just to be clear here, this white man had killed a young black boy by throwing rocks at him because he had crossed an unofficial, unmarked line. It's horrible, and it's racist, and it's aggressive. And so understandably, the African Americans on the beach are infuriated, and the white people are coming to defend this white man, even though he has clearly committed a crime. He is clearly in the wrong. The police are called. A black police officer wants to arrest. He wants to arrest the white man who had done this act, who had killed this boy. but he is prevented by the white officers. Tensions start to brew, and eventually violence explodes across Chicago as news of what happened went on. This violence was white on black violence. It was white on black violence, not the other way around. We have strong evidence that the Irish American community in Chicago, which was significant, saw this as an opportunity to get rid of black people in Chicago and tried to encourage a large-scale race war in the city and encourage immigrant groups like the Poles or the Italians to attack black neighborhoods. They had little success in inciting a wide-scale attempt at ethnic cleansing and white on black violence, but there was a lot of white on black violence nonetheless. Ultimately, 38 people die because of this violence that rages over several days. Of those, 25 are black. White people had burned communities, or had burned black neighborhoods, leaving 1,000 black families homeless, 1,000 people homeless. It was an atrocity and a tragedy, and it was racially motivated. Perhaps the worst episode of violence. Oh, by the way, before we move over to Chicago, I just want to indicate here. This is Chicago. This is outside the Jim Crow South. It's an indication of racism and hatred in the North. Perhaps the worst episode of violence in the 1920s was in Tulsa in 1921, in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Tulsa, Oklahoma was home to a prosperous African American community, a prosperous black population. It was often nicknamed Black Wall Street because it was one of the few areas in the South, one of the few areas in the United States, where black people had been able to acquire a certain amount of wealth through their own businesses and professions. So it was an affluent black neighborhood. Well, what happens in 1921 is that one day a black boy who is a shoe shiner, he shines shoes in downtown, is accused of raping a white woman who worked in the same area of him, that he worked in. The white woman was an elevator operator. And this was a job back then, is that you couldn't operate an elevator yourself, that you had someone who was trained to operate the elevator, and they were in the elevator at all times, operating it, taking you up and down the floors. And so she was an elevator operator. She was white, and she accused a young black man, he was a teenager, who worked as a shoe shine worker in the neighborhood, in the block that she worked in. She accused him of raping him. The boy was arrested. The young man, the teenager, he was arrested, and he was put in jail. And in cases like this, when a white person accused a black person of a crime, more often than not in the South, a black person could not be guaranteed a trial or a fair trial, even if it went to trial. But more often than not, particularly with cases of rape or murder or accused violence, a white mob would gather and engage in vigilante justice and lynch the person before they could have a trial. Now keep in mind, there's no evidence that this teenager, this young man, has committed this crime. He was just accused by a white person. But nonetheless, the black community in Oklahoma fears that a white mob will come and lynch him before he can have his day in court. Not that being in court is going to guarantee you any kind of fairness, but at the very least, it guarantees you some modicum of protection versus the lynching mob. So, African Americans arm themselves and go down to the courthouse to protect this young man. This then causes the white community in Tulsa to go absolutely ballistic. And they arm themselves and they begin to descend upon the black neighborhoods of Tulsa and engage in all sorts of violence over several days. You can see the remnants of homes and buildings in Tulsa's black neighborhood that were burned to the ground in the historic photo that I have on this slide. When all was said and done, 10,000 people in the most prosperous black community in the country were homeless. 39 were confirmed dead. Scholars estimate between 75 and 300 were probably killed. Even though white people were responsible for the violence and the burning of the homes, over 6,000 black residents were arrested as a consequence of the riot. It was a horrible atrocity. The 1920s also sees a renewal or a refounding of the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan is a complicated, understanding its origins and its early history is complicated for historians. And there's two basic schools of thought. The first school of thought says that the Ku Klux Klan was founded after the Civil War, and we know it was. There's agreement from both schools of thought that this is true. The Klan committed acts of terrorism to black residents, but the Union Army stationed down there was effective in rooting it out and destroying it. And the Klan was dead as an organization until it was refounded in the 1920s. And why was it refounded in the 1920s? It was refounded in the 1920s primarily because of the popularity of a film, The Birth of the Nation, which presented the Ku Klux Klan as a heroic organization, a patriotic organization, and an organization that reflected the true values of America. And so one school of thought says the Ku Klux Klan was refounded in the 1920s because it didn't exist, because it had been destroyed by Union armies. That's one school of thought. Another school of thought says the Klan was not destroyed, but greatly weakened by the Army. It survived after Reconstruction, and it exploded in the 1920s. I personally don't think it's important which one is correct. I personally subscribe to the idea that it probably still existed in a smaller form and exploded in the 1920s. But whether it was refounded or renewed in the 1920s, it doesn't matter very much to me. What matters that you know is it explodes in popularity. It becomes mainstream. There are 5 million members of the Ku Klux Klan in 1925. 5 million. 5 million. We know this because they kept records. And people were more open about their Klan membership. In the 1920s, it wasn't a secret organization. It was an organization that men belonged to in a way that they were expressing their deeply held beliefs. 40,000 of them paraded in Washington, D.C., not marched and were dispersed by the police, but paraded openly. If you go into the archives of towns and cities, be they small or large, across the United States in the 1920s, and find festivals, because most towns and cities have at least one or two festivals. If you look at photos from the 1920s, you can find photos of Klansmen participating in local parades. In the town that I'm from, Wenatchee, Washington, there's an Apple Blossom Festival. And Wenatchee is a small town today. It was a very tiny blip on the map in Washington State in the 1920s. But Wenatchee has an Apple Blossom Festival to celebrate the apple blossoms and the apple industry. You can find photos from the 1920s of the Klan marching in the Apple Blossom Parade in the 1920s. It's an example of how the Klan has gone mainstream. It's become publicly acceptable to belong to it. It's a sign of racial attitudes in the United States. Now, one must be clear that the Klan of the 1920s is different from the Klan of the post-Civil War period, regardless of whether you think it was renewed or refounded. The Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s is much wider in its white supremacist beliefs. It is still a racist group whose hate is mostly directed at African Americans. However, it is also a group that has become anti-immigrant, particularly anti-Catholic, and is also anti-Semitic. It's become anti-Jewish. And so it is a group whose hate has widened its focus in the 1920s. To conclude this lecture, I want to talk a little bit about national politics because the 1920s represents the ascendancy of the Republican Party. So, all throughout the world, the parties that had engaged in World War I find themselves rejected in electoral politics after World War I. The Democratic Party under Woodrow Wilson had led the United States into war, and the 1920s is going to see a series of Republican presidents. First, Warren G. Harding from Ohio. You can see him here. Harding is elected in 1920. He is generally considered one of our worst and most corrupt presidents. And there were many different corruption scandals and bribery scandals during his presidency. The most famous, which is the Teapot Dome scandal. But Harding dies in office. He dies on August 2nd, 1923. He's succeeded by Calvin Coolidge. You can see Coolidge here. Coolidge will be reelected in 1924. Coolidge will refuse to run for reelection in 1928. And instead, the Commerce Secretary under Harding and Coolidge, his name is Herbert Hoover, will run for president, and he will be elected. But all the presidents of the 1920s are Republicans. They are traditional Republicans and not not Theodore Roosevelt's Republican Party. So they are not progressive reformers. And these Republicans were dedicated to not extending the legacy of the progressive era, particularly under Woodrow Wilson, and they were committed to favoring the interests of business and commerce. They were also committed opponents of organized labor. And so what you can see is a period in the 1920s that because of government policy at the top, there is a complete halt to the progressive era's reforms and a complete halt to any gains that workers and organized labor have made. It also helps to explain why we get immigration restrictions. Because remember, the Republicans are the WASP party. They're the party that nativists found the greatest support within. So it makes sense that under Republicans you would get nativist immigration restrictions. All right. There is your very brief overview of the 1920s. I thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye for now.